extend a warm welcome to the viewers of this program, which is a part of CEC Gurukul lectures. As we have been discussing the feminist literary traditions in this series, today I have taken up for discussion the essay The Female Tradition from a Literature of Their Own by Elaine Showalter. Now, Elaine Showalter has become is a famous critic, feminist critic of the 20th century, she's an American feminist critic to be precise, who was born in 1941 and rose to fame in the 1970s for her focused kind of study on the literary history of women writers. She actually also founded the school of feminist criticism, gynocritics, and analyzed works of women writers, looking for the lost women writers in history, charting their real and artistic lives. Gynocritics, therefore, searched for specific themes and genres used by women writers in particular in order to form a kind of an alternate critical canon of women's literature. Now, the important point, as you would realize, for Elaine Showalter was to carve out a sort of a history of women writers through the agency of a kind of a critical canon, which could be called a female critical canon. Now, her work, of course, began in the 1970s, and she is known most for her book, A Literature of Their Own, British Women Novelists from Bronte to Lessing, which was published in 1977. And it was a step in this direction of framing this kind of a critical framework through which novels by women novelists could be assessed away from the male critical lens. Now, you see, so far she realized that feminism couldn't find its feet or couldn't grow unless it had its own history, unless it had a kind of its own beginning, a sense of past. And if writers and thinkers had to each time do the dig work, each time look for a past, look for a kind of a lineage, a kind of a inheritance, then there was feminism certainly would not go anywhere. And she realized, as a critic, as a female, as a feminist critic, she realized that there was very little work that was done in the sphere of women's literature. Very little work was done in formulating women's literatures, women, or any kind of theoretical work was certainly missing. So she took it upon herself to go into the literature of the 19th century and beyond and before to see if there were writers who had been missed, there were writers who were probably lost, and what was feminist criticism like, or women's criticism like, in the earlier centuries? Did it even exist, or as the male critical canon would have us believe, they weren't anywhere to be found? So, Elaine Showalter's work has been path-breaking in that sense. It's a groundbreaking work that she did. Of course, she took she extended the argument of Virginia Woolf forward. As you know, Virginia Woolf spoke about a room of one's own, a room which was kind of a sense of privacy, a kind of a woman's space that she was talking about. Again, here Showalter took from Virginia Woolf the idea that there was this particular point that Virginia Woolf focused on in A Room of One's Own, where she said that the extraordinary woman depends on the ordinary woman for taking forward this chain of feminist ideas. So, this is something that Elaine Showalter seems to have taken up as a task of her own, that to find not only the extraordinary writers of the 19th century, but also those minor writers, thinkers, who probably had enough equal amount of contribution to make in the sphere of women writing, but they were left out in criticism. That was one interesting thing that she took up from Virginia Woolf. The other thing also that Virginia Woolf in fact took up when she talked about Shakespeare's sister, for instance, in Her Room of One's Own. And she talked about, in Room of One's Own again, the idea that when she tried to think about women and fiction, she could not find in any history book anything that told her about how women lived their lives, what were their careers, what did they do, how did they pass their time, and what was it that made up their life. Was it just domesticity or was there more? But history books obviously disappointed Virginia Woolf at that time, where she felt that the task, of historians has been, or male historians, has been largely biased. Again, taking this cue, Elaine Showalter builds her argument in a literature of their own, the task of finding British women novelists, one from Bronte to Lessing, which she actually does in this book, but also to find women writers who existed in the 18th century but were not registered. Maybe they registered their presence through certain manuscripts, but they were not published, and even if they were published, perhaps they had been discarded over centuries. So what I'm really trying to tell you here is that the feminist movement and feminist critics have gained strength from one another. Elaine Showalter certainly, even when she criticizes Virginia Woolf at one or two places, she certainly draws a lot of strength from Virginia Woolf's arguments and takes it forward with the benefit of scholarship and the new fields of academia that opened up, the disciplines, the interdisciplinary approach that came in the 1960s, that in a way helped Showalter to build another kind of history of women's writing that Virginia Woolf initially hinted at. At the same time, what I'm trying to also suggest is that the feminist movement requires a kind of a continuum, which feminists in the 1960s and 70s realized, that they require a kind of a continuum of writings to be able to, something that can sustain the feminist movement. And that continuum cannot exist if you leave certain women novelists or certain women writers out of this chain. And that in order that women have to build a sort of a legacy, and women writers have a legacy, but only it has been either hidden from public view or deliberately discarded. All of this actually points towards the very political nature of scholarship that has so far existed. This is also a point that Showalter takes up in her work, particularly this particular seminal book of hers, A Literature of Their Own, that how it has been a political endeavor on the part of male writers and male critics rather, who have deliberately kept women out of any kind of mainstream literature. And it is political because that way they could prove that either women novelists did not exist or women writers did not exist, or that they were much inferior, that they could not make way to any kind of literary history. So writing a literary history for women, as Elaine Showalter tries to do, is also a political act, because she is trying to make that, trying to emphasize the point that women have their tradition of writing, that there is a literary history that can be called a female literary history, or that can be called the female literary tradition. And this is the title of the essay that I plan to take up today, The Female Tradition from A Literature of Their Own. So A Literature of Their Own is the book, and The Female Tradition is the essay that I'd be discussing with you today. Now, let's see what Elaine Showalter says has been saying in this book. To begin with, let me give you certain points to begin with. Elaine Showalter actually takes up the ideas of first 19th century writers and thinkers who probably had something to say about women novelists. So how she begins her work is by telling us how women novelists have been perceived over centuries. For instance, how women writers particularly, were perceived in the 19th century. How did fellow men writers look at these women novelists? Secondly, she goes on to talk about how this perception changed in the 20th century and whether it was any less biased really. She finds, of course, that it wasn't, that 19th century male writers viewed women's literature in a particular way, and 20th century writers also, or thinkers or critics, viewed women novelists in a particular way, which meant that the perception of women writers in different centuries went on to prove that there were some inherent biases that were there in these male critical enterprises, simply because it was a part of this, what she calls a kind of a male cultural imperialism, because the cultural space is so much dominated by patriarchy, by men's ideas, that there was very little space to include women's experiences and women's ideas. So she finds that both in the 19th and the 20th century, writers and thinkers, particularly male, had a kind of a stereotypical or had a stereotype in mind, which they applied to women novelists. So, so she begins her essay by talking about this kind of perception of women writers over the centuries. Then she also goes on to talk about several other things, which in a way I could just put in a nutshell for you right now, so that when we go ahead, you can trace these movements. So while talking about these writers, she also goes on to talk about, the kind of the activity of male criticism, which has been mostly dedicated to what she calls a kind of a residual grade tradition. In the sense, she says that certain women writers have been taken up and picked up for analysis, and they've constituted the great tradition of writers, but this kind of activity actually left out several minor writers. So she says that I will focus on the minor writers equally, if not more, as I do the major writers. So that is another thing, that to find minor writers in the 19th centuries who contributed to this larger framework of women's literature. So that is another exercise that she takes up. Now, before we go ahead, let me just give you an example of a couple of quotes that she takes up. She begins her essay with G.H. Lewis's quote. G.H. Lewis, who was otherwise a liberal, and a partner of George Eliot, he wrote this essay, The Lady Novelist, in 1852. And there he pointed out how women's literature was actually a literature of imitation. And he wrote, and I quote, "To write as men write is the aim and besetting sin of women. To write as women is the real task that they have to perform." End quote. Now, this is quoted in the female tradition, the essay, right? And this is how she begins her essay, suggesting that even writers in the 19th century, the liberal ones, could see that the flaw in women's writing, which was because women mostly took to imitation, and that became their besetting sin in a way, that their real task was to write as women. But were they able to do this? Were they able to move out of the clutches of male tyranny of ideas? Could they write as women? Would society allow them? Would a society that is intrinsically hostile to women writing itself think of the point that if a woman read too much, if a woman knew too much, was political enough, if she boasted of her knowledge, she was known as the blue stocking, which was and therefore seen as unfeminine and therefore seen as unnatural. So obviously women had to fight prejudices of society. They had to fight along with that a kind of a self-doubt that visited them often, whether in writing they were doing something unnatural, whether they were being unfeminine, and was it okay to be unfeminine. So these were the questions that they had to deal with, and rightly they were in order to impress, in order to make their way in society, they thought perhaps the best way to do that would be to write like men, and perhaps that was their real problem. To write like men was the besetting sin of women, but did they have a choice? Could they write otherwise? Of course, certain writers, the major ones as we know them, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, Jane Austen too, to some extent, they speak their mind and they write what they think, and there is a kind of intensity of emotion in their works, and so they are able to in a way subvert the authority, the male authority, but not to the extent where there is a kind of a self-awareness, even though when these writers, when this exercise turned to a kind of a feminist exercise in the 1960s, we must remember that Elaine Showalter is also a product of the period, of women's liberation movement. There was suffrage, of course, of the 1920s, but then by the time you reach 1960s, you've already reached a phase where there are a lot of movements, women's liberation movement, particularly in England and America, both, where women are no more fighting for right to vote, but fighting for a kind of a greater freedom to be a woman. And this women's liberation movement had a great role to play in this kind of feminist movement that came up in the 1970s, right? We often make the distinction between American feminism and French feminism, but we must remember it was owing to this women's liberation movement of the 1960s, to be precise around 1968, that you find that there was a kind of a feminist kind of a resurgence that occurred in all spheres of knowledge, in all scholarships, and it was an interdisciplinary approach. It was there in psychology, it was there in philosophy, it was there in literature and sociology, and in art, art historians took up. And it is this exercise that led to women thinking about scholarship of women, thinking about building, taking up the task of building a history of women writers, of women's literature. So you see, it is in this background, against this background, that Elaine Showalter is writing this essay, where she can go back and has the advantage of the hindsight to be able to look at these writers in the 19th century and how they perceived the woman writer, what according to them was the problem or the qualities of women writing. Another theorist, John Stuart Mill, the critic, again a liberal critic, who wrote The Subjection of Women in 1869, argued that women found it difficult to overcome the influence of male literary tradition in the 19th century. They could not create an original and independent art. In John Stuart Mill's words, if women lived in a different country from men and had never read anything of their writings, they would have a literature of their own. End quote. What does Mill mean by that? That if women lived in a different country or maybe on an island and had never read anything that men wrote, perhaps they would have then a literature of their own. What is the larger meaning behind this kind of a quotation? Again, this is a quotation taken from the female tradition that Showalter quotes John Stuart Mill and Lewis to suggest how 19th century liberal men also looked at women. Now, what Mill really was suggesting is that they are burdened by a kind of a critical enterprise. You see, a critical canon is something which tells us how literature is to be written. What are the things that are important? What are the things that are unimportant? What should be emphasized? What should be there and should not be there in a work of art? Now, when you have the shoulds and should nots, which are basically male-centric, which are basically also meant for male readership, how would women fight it? How would women write what they emphasize, what they think is important, when they write like men, when they behave like men, when they behave like men in writing? Then they are, of course, imitating men, because they have this kind of a set canon. This should be there in a piece of work and this shouldn't be. But then women didn't know how to find their own canon and what to write. Could they write all that they thought? They actually did, and they took different forms, for instance, using the Gothic to subvert the authority of men, to give space to their repressions, came handy to women. So they had their own patterns, they had their own themes, they had their own way of writing. And a lot of women experimented with it also, just that we never gave them the required space, or we judged them against male critical standards. So John Stuart Mill is also trying to say here that women, have been overpowered or controlled by this kind of a male-centric literature, and they seem to be following it. Both George Henry Lewis and J.S. Mill, who were spokesmen for women's rights at the time and Victorian liberalism in general, felt that, and again this quote is from Showalter, like the Romans in the shadow of Greece, women were overshadowed by male cultural imperialism. Of course, they are drawing this comparison, but that comparison has to say a lot about women's condition, also about in the cultural space, that there was a kind of a what does in fact male, when Showalter mentions male cultural imperialism, what does in fact male cultural imperialism mean? It means that every sphere of culture, every space of culture, writing, reading, thinking, ideas in society related to religion, related to custom, rituals, practices taken up every day. All this constitutes culture. And when you speak of an imperialism in this cultural space, then you're really speaking of a kind of a hegemony. The kind of hegemony that male exercised, that it was their sense of right and wrong that prevailed in society. It was their sense, their idea of fantasy. Perhaps there is a different kind of a female fantasy, or was there just male fantasy becomes the fantasy? Do we see male fantasy as the generalized universal kind of fantasy? Do we see male idea of pleasure as the universal idea of pleasure? So the point that anything that is universal is equal to, or normal or natural is equal to male. This is what male cultural imperialism could suggest in the context. And women were in fact seeped in it. They were in fact themselves a victim of it. How would they fight such a thing? The 19th century, while the 19th century was actually the age of the female novelist, if you think of Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, George Eliot, you find that they all had a lot of aptitude and plenty of emotional intensity to drive it, right? To drive their works. And yet they also felt a sense of a kind of self-doubt. You have Charlotte Bronte always in a state of self-doubt. George Eliot, in fact, also said that, at one place that the speciality of women is this kind of maternal affection. Again, the idea of attaching certain values to women, that, a maternal affection comes naturally to them. You've already divided them. You've already created a binary, which in literature, somehow these writers are able to transcend. In literature, they don't stick to their feminine form. In fact, Charlotte Bronte in one of her letters also mentioned that, I don't see myself as the feminine writer when I'm writing. It is, I don't see my literature, my writing in that sense. So Elaine Showalter highlights these aspects of novelists who had to face this kind of a larger question in society, and this larger question, according to Showalter, was, and I quote, whether women excluded by custom and education from achieving distinction in poetry, history or drama had in defining their literary culture in the novel simply appropriated another masculine genre. Was it the case that women who had been excluded from education, excluded by education, from achieving distinction, right? How could they achieve distinction in the first place if they were excluded, by education and custom and tradition? And were, when they started writing the novel, just as they had written poetry and history and drama before, were they also, while writing the novel in the 19th century, just appropriating the masculine genre? Which meant, did the novel become a kind of a female novel, or did it remain a male novel which was just tinkered with by women writers? And therefore, you find that literature in the 19th century, and Showalter finds it particularly, that literature of the 19th century did not, did not articulate women's experiences. It did not talk about a kind of an autonomous self, or a kind, or did not give space to autonomous self-expression. That is what Showalter finally comes to the conclusion of. And therefore, she says that, novelists of the 19th century have always been self-conscious, and they have been rarely self-defining. According to her, they are perennially aware of individual identities and experiences, but they very infrequently they bring that experience on to their writing. They do not see themselves. Another point which she makes, Showalter, here, is that the female novelists, right, they are not able to transcend the personal and the local space, or their own self rather. They don't see themselves as a kind of a collectivity. They don't see themselves as a kind of or their writings as a kind of a collective form in art, and that can reveal a history of its own. So according to Showalter, that has been the problem, and which is what this is a kind of a imbalance that she tries to correct, that trying to see women's novels, women's writings as a kind of a collective entity and a kind of a collective form that could reveal a history of its own. And this is something that she takes up as an enterprise in this particular book of hers. And and returning to the perception, that women writers have gained, she finds that discussions around women writers, criticism on women writers and their novels, really these discussions have been inaccurate. Rather, they have been fragmented or partisan, as she says, and biased in all spheres. She finds that that this was not just the case with for instance, 19th century writers alone. Even writers, and there would be kind of a stereotype which would be built around women writers. For instance, even interests in their works or the personal lives of writers would be based on their idea of how women, a stereotypical idea of women, which would be about women who have their fingers steeped in ink and so on and so forth. So this kind of a bias in criticism has existed in history both in the 19th and the 20th century, according to Elaine Showalter, and she tries to bring this bias out and talk about the evolution of female literary history. This is a kind of an introduction that I wanted to give you today on this essay. We will be taking up the discussion in another form in another lecture. We would go to the specific concepts of Elaine Showalter. That's it for now.